Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I have found in my travels. Today, I want to talk about a book that I read, one that was recommended to me by my friend Bevan, and she's been on quite a streak with recommending really good books to me, and also some that are so-so, but we'll skip over the so-so ones. Is this one equally good? Watch along to find out, but the spoiler is yes. It's a book about divorce. I am referring to Fleishman is in Trouble by Taffy Brodesser-Akner, which was published in 2019. For those who don't know, Taffy Brodesser-Akner, which is quite possibly the most unique name that I've ever heard, is a writer from Brooklyn. She is a Jewish writer. This is the only book that she's ever written, but she's written a number of articles and profiles about Britney Spears and Damon Lindelof, I think it is, among other people. She grew up Orthodox Jewish, which I think does show up in this book here. It's based a little bit on her experiences, and I wonder how much, because it says that she is married on her profile. But if that's true, and if anything else is based on her experience, I wonder how much of this like soul-sucking endeavor of a book is based on her life, which would be, a little bit sad to know. This is like the first thing that she's truly written or had published. And I would like to see more of her writing down the road, especially if she can capture a similar atmosphere or the same magic, because this is a high quality book. Spoilers, I'm going to recommend it down the road. This was also published in 2019. So it's fairly new, but I don't think there are any major spoilers with it. And I don't think me telling you like the entire summary is going to impact your ability to enjoy it. That said, I am going to talk about the entire story in the summary. So if you want to read it, now would be the time to do it, and you can come back to the video afterwards. But without further ado, let's talk about Fleishman is in Trouble. I will do a summary, a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. So Fleishman is in Trouble focuses on three characters, I would say three characters. Toby Fleishman, his wife Rachel, and the narrator, which is interesting, who is one of Toby's friends, a character in the story, but also just the general narrator who seems to know quite a bit, and that is Elizabeth. Who was a friend from childhood, lost contact with Toby, and then regained contact after he got divorced. But Toby and Rachel are recently divorced. Toby is kind of middle-aged, a very neurotic kind of man, very anxious. But he finds that after he got divorced, he's kind of, as the kids would say, drowning in ass, where he's on a bunch of dating apps, and when women are sending him lewd messages, having a lot of sex with them, he's set standards so that he's only dating women of his age, because the younger women seem too innocent and like they haven't experienced life like he has yet. So he's mostly dating women around his age. He's also a pretty successful doctor, and one of the complaints from his marriage was that Rachel thought he wasn't ambitious enough, although he was determined to be a very competent doctor, and he felt he would get promoted down the road, which is indeed a focal point of the story, and that he's up for promotion as the story progresses. As well as at this point in the story, like at the beginning, he reunites with his friends Seth and Elizabeth. They're his Jewish friends from his younger years. Seth is kind of a man whore, as it were, just sleeping around quite a bit. Although as the story progresses, he meets a woman named Vanessa and begins to engage in a very serious relationship with her, although he's never really seen marriage as an option. And Elizabeth is straight up married. It's kind of implied that Elizabeth and Toby had a relationship in their youth, but Toby didn't want to pursue it further because he viewed Elizabeth too much trouble, like she was crazy or something like that, which she's never really gotten over. And you see those frustrations in her narration of the story. And despite being disconnected from Rachel in this story, he is still having sex with her. Like, they both have those needs, and Toby says like half of all the sex that he is having after getting divorced is still with Rachel. So they're not really willing to lose that kind of contact. And even she says that she hopes they remain lunchtime friends or something like that. Toby and Rachel have children, and they have a custody agreement where it seems like Rachel gets the kids for most of the time. As the story starts, Rachel drops Toby or the kids off at Toby's house and goes off on a sort of vacation without them. And as the weekend progresses, Rachel stops responding to his text or his phone calls, which enrages Toby because he sees this as her dropping the ball yet again, her being so focused on ambition and whatnot, and not really helping the kids. And eventually he just has to drop the kids off at camp, and also tries to reassure them that their mom is still paying attention to them. But Toby is beginning to suspect that Rachel might be dead or something, because she's not responding to his phone calls anymore. And it eventually gets to a point where he just decides to contact his lawyers to try to get custody because she's no longer present. Like, even when the kids come back from camp due to a sort of a social emergency, he's like, yeah, your mom's disappeared, and I think it's just us now. However, while Toby is talking with some other school moms from the kids' school, they mention him that they saw Rachel at the park, and this again enrages Toby because it seems like Rachel has stopped caring completely, and it only confirms that Rachel was never a good mother to begin with in Toby's eyes. The story also flashes back to various parts of their relationship, their early marriage, like when Toby met Rachel and how Toby felt excitement being around Rachel, and how Rachel was happy to be a part of Toby's family because she had grown up an orphan, only being raised by her grandmother who didn't show her a lot of love. The story also talks about Rachel's pregnancy and how she kind of felt violated when the doctor reached inside of her to burst her membrane so she could begin the process of birth, and how she never really connected to her children as a result of that. She kind of felt cheated in the process. We also hear a bit of Elizabeth's frustrations with Toby, as she kind of narrates how Toby is kind of up his own ass at times and how he could be a jerk, which Toby doesn't seem to reflect on at all. He doesn't even reflect on why Rachel is angry in the marriage. He just notes that she is. Again, the papers come that from the lawyers saying that he has custody of the children now. He has to go back to the camp to pick up Hannah, as well as Solly, his son, because it turns out that Hannah sent a sexy picture, a nude picture, to a boy, and that boy shared it with a bunch of other people. And Toby is unfortunately ill-equipped to help Hannah in dealing with such an issue, and the children begin to suffer as a result, with Solly wetting the bed and Hannah just growing angrier and angrier, and no one really helping her because Toby isn't equipped to deal with such problems. And at the same time, he learns, because all the time he had to took off from work, that the hospital that he works at no longer wants to give him the promotion that he's up for, and so all that time of pushing away ambition and whatnot seems to have not really worked for Toby. Meanwhile, Elizabeth notes that she met Rachel in New York City, and Rachel went on about her side of the story, how she eventually, after this failed marriage where Toby really wasn't listening to her, she eventually cheated with Sam Rothberg, I think it is, or something like that, who was married to one of her so-called best friends, who she was really only friends with in order to climb the social ladder. And they seemed to develop quite a relationship, so much so that she was ready to get a divorce from Toby. And they went off to the vacation retreat. But Rachel began to have a breakdown at that point, and that turned off Sam, and so he left her. And Rachel's been going through this breakdown cycle where she hasn't been able to sleep and hasn't been able to really focus, and she's really upset about having gotten the divorce in the first place. And then around that time, Elizabeth leaves her and she rejoins her own husband, who she was beginning to think that she didn't really want to be with, and maybe to some degree she didn't really want to be with him, but she eventually decides that she is loved and being loved is enough. Maybe she doesn't really need any more, or she can't really ask for any more. There's a lot of stuff that's worth looking into at that point. And as the story comes to an end, Toby really feels that he's moved on with his life, but there is a knock at the door. When he turns around, Rachel is standing there, and that's where the story ends there. It's left on that sort of cliffhanger. In terms of analysis, what an interesting and very melancholy book this is. I don't think I really did an effective job of describing the melancholy in the summary section, but it is plastered throughout the book, and especially when you get to Rachel's section where it just sucks the life out of you in a good way. I would say it's not melancholy for the sake of being sad. It's being done to make a point about marriage, divorce, feminism, love, all those sorts of ideas, and Taffy is really good at doing it. But one of the ideas that Taffy is playing around with in this story, or really the centerpiece of it, is the idea of the anatomy of a marriage and a divorce. What goes into a marriage? What makes it work? What makes it doesn't? Why do people get divorced? Why is divorce maybe sometimes a good idea? And in order to really explore that here, you have to talk about both Toby and Rachel. How Toby is a neurotic Jewish man who was raised to be self-conscious because his mother pointed out that he was fat and friendless, and so that kind of lovelessness was carried around with him. And when he finally got into like college and after that, he realized that he could be loved, and that's around the time that he met Rachel. And when he met Rachel, he really found a sense of excitedness about a willingness to be loved, a willingness to be around someone, maybe a friend to be with. But I think it's clear that that Toby didn't really like decide to marry Rachel because of because he wanted to get married. It was more what he saw in himself that he found with Rachel. And Rachel is much of the same here. Rachel is a person who never really had love. She was dealing with the trauma of her past. Her grandmother raised her. Her father didn't want anything to do with her. Her mother had died, and her grandmother wasn't really capable of love, capable of doing much. She was kind of angry at times, and so for Rachel, what she sees in Toby is an opportunity for a family. Like something that she's never had before. Sure, she might very well love Toby. I think they both do to some extent in this story. But when you get down to it, neither of them are really marrying each other because marriage is the right thing to do in their relationship. It's the logical next step for them. Rather, they're doing it because of what they're hoping to get out of one another. And maybe that's what Taffy's arguing like throughout the story, is that's all marriage really is you trying to get something out of another person. And sometimes it's very functional, but other times it just doesn't work when two people want like completely different things from one another, especially when Rachel is ambitious and Toby's really fine just doing the good work and putting it forth, and maybe one day he'll get promoted. There's a really good quote that I'd like to read to you from this. She was so angry, and the anger was so scary, that Rachel stopped asking for approximations of normal childhood, and instead settled for what would have to pass for love, which was the absence of outward displays of animosity and rage. And that's a very interesting quote because, one, it kind of shows what Rachel's dealing with, the trauma of her upbringing and what she might have been looking for. Someone like Toby who was pleasant to be around and seemed to genuinely love her. But it's also interesting because it says, which was the absence of outward displays of animosity and rage. Now that's really fascinating because multiple times throughout the story, Rachel complains, rightfully so, that Toby is filled with rage. Like he doesn't outwardly fight Rachel or anything like that, but he is very angry inside from his own past. And for Rachel to point that out, it's like she's calling attention to her own past. She's saying, I don't feel comfortable in this relationship because you remind me of the worst time in my life. And I think that's really fascinating because how it just demonstrates that this marriage is not going to work out ever, because of these two people carrying stuff that they haven't resolved. And so the question becomes, like, why stay together? Like, why would you stay together? Like, Rachel doesn't truly want to get a divorce. And Toby's hesitant at first. They go to therapy, but why stay together? And I think you can answer that through Elizabeth and Seth. Seth, for example, like, he spent his entire life not seeking out marriage because he feels like it's not really going to work out for him. But ultimately, he decides to get married, and I think it's because everybody wants to feel loved in some way. And like, if you spend too long staying single, you're just going to be that bachelor friend for the rest of your life. And so, like, you're staying together because maybe outside that marriage, there's nothing left for you anymore. And like, Elizabeth is another good example of this, because she spends the entire summer that Toby's dealing with this issue, like, she spends it analyzing her own relationship with Adam, her husband, deciding that she doesn't really like how it feels, and how this is just a reflection of the feminist failings that have happened for her over the years. But ultimately, she decides that she wants to stay with Adam because she is loved, that there is love there, and that having that love is better than nothing at all. And the unfortunate truth is, Taffy's not saying that we should be in a marriage because, like, that's the right thing for us to do because this is the person who we belong with. She's just saying that, like, you should stay in this marriage. People often stay in marriage because there's love there. We feel we might not get that love anywhere else, or we're too old and the world has passed us by in some way. And I think that's really fascinating, like, how she gets to that point, that kind of breaking down our illusions of what marriage is, and also the necessity of divorce, because once Toby and Rachel get divorced, they initially feel great about it. And like, I'm pretty sure on a long enough time period, both of them would be in a better place for having gotten that divorce. But like, Toby and Rachel, like, a bunch of other stuff comes up for them, but that divorce is still essential, because they don't, like, all that hate, all that anger, all that rage toward each other, all those frustrations, like, that doesn't feel good, and that's certainly not good for the children. Like, there are a whole bunch of good reasons for divorce in any failing marriage, but staying together ultimately doesn't benefit anyone involved. There's another good quote that I would like to read to you from this. But also, divorce is about forgetfulness, a decision to stop remembering the moment before all the chaos, the moment they fell in love, the moment they knew they were more special together than apart. And I think that's another interesting quote, because it's sort of highlighting that like, marriage is all about, like, maintaining the memory of all the good things that have happened to you, that special moment of when you fell in love. And divorce is the opposite, where it's sort of like forgetting that moment that you fell in love. And I think that's great, because when we're fighting with one another, when those moments of like, where you truly despise your spouse or something like that, and things just aren't working out, like, you may be compelled to remember those good moments so you can stay together. But that doesn't always work, and that's not always healthy. And so that divorce allows us to forget those moments so that we can move, heal, go forward, and try to find a better relationship for ourselves. Because it's clear that, you know, staying in the one that's toxic isn't going to really benefit all of us. And this really leads me to question, like, what does the ending mean of this story? Because at the very end, Rachel shows up at Toby's door. Is she coming to talk to the kids again and rekindle that? Is she coming to rekindle the marriage? Is she coming to really call Toby out for what he's done? Is she coming for the feminist revenge that she's entitled to? I think you could make a lot of arguments. I think that if they don't rekindle their marriage, that's great, because it's been shown they do not work well together. They would be much better suited like, being with other people. But also, if they do end up together, that's very thematically, like, fit for what's going on in this story. That them recognizing that their marriage was complete garbage, complete shit, but they're still together because who else is there for them? They might be the only ones for each other, even though that's probably not true. Like, some love is better than no love at all, and maybe they might be able to learn from their mistakes, which I highly doubt. That's my interpretation of the ending. I think there's 1,000 different interpretations of that ending, and I encourage you to read this and, comment and tell me why you think that is. Another interesting element of this story is the feminist philosophy that's underlying all of it. much of Rachel's anger in this story stems from misogyny that she's faced in life. I mentioned the violation from the doctor where he reached inside her and broke the membrane so that she would be able to give birth, like which she felt was completely wrong and not exactly what she wanted. It happens to so many married women in real life. Doctors kind of taking advantage or feeling that they know what's best when it in fact violates the rights of women. There's also her former boss who made moves on her and viewed her as just a woman and refused to promote her, so much so that she had to kind of grab the brass ring and raise herself up and then leave and fight even harder because, as the narrator notes multiple times, like in the working world, things are so much harder for women and they often don't get the recognition that they deserve, especially when in articles that are written, because for men it's about their soul and their essence of being and how they got here, and for women it's about how they overcame obstacles, that being the only thing that focused on, because a woman who rises above the ranks, that's all she can be. Like she has to be made to suffer for her ambition, which is what happens to Rachel here. And then there's also Toby just ignoring the problems, kind of, even though he was being a doting father and let Rachel be, or not really let, but allowed Rachel to be ambitious. Like there were still lingering problems that like he expected Rachel to be a mother in addition to having that full career. Like Toby tried to be that father and he wasn't very good at it. And much like many relationships, there's still that expectation of the second shift with the wife doing a lot of work. And when Rachel doesn't do it, Toby just straight up calls her a bad mother, which there might be some argument for that, but also why? Why would you say that? Like, couldn't you, don't call people out like that. That negatively affected her in a way that I don't think Toby realized because he was so self-centered. And this is much shown through Elizabeth's realization at the end of the story as she's narrating, pretty much talking about how she expected more from her relationship and ultimately didn't get it because how she was a woman and her the only thing she could really do in life was give herself to a man. And like no matter how great she did, she'd still be in the shadow of that man, among many other things. I encourage you to read this and find it. Like, I don't think I'm doing a fair explanation here. And ultimately how women are seen as lesser. Ultimately showing like not only is this a story about marriage and divorce, but this is also a story about how women like that they are not given the credit they are due. Marriage is so much harder for them than men often, and they have to go through life feeling like marginalized second-class citizens, and any success that they feel is negotiated. It's given to them by men rather than truly recognized, and if they earn anything on their own, that's punished in some form. There are other elements of the story that I think are fascinating. The collapse, as I call it, that happens in the story, where everything that's building up for Toby just comes crashing down, is also mirrored in Rachel's story, where she meets Sam and is like, I'm going to get divorced and everything's going to go great for me. And then Sam leaves her and she comes to this realization that she's having a breakdown, and it's like a collapse for both of them. And it feels so awful. It feels so terrible, but it's possibly one of the best pieces of like fiction ever written in that part, where it's just like the way it mirrors one another and the way that it kind of highlights that you're never truly free of that marriage, that it's always going to grasp onto you, is so sad and also so poignant. And that's, along with what I was just saying, is the compelling writing, which like the way she writes and the way she weaves a story is pretty fascinating. My only issue is that sometimes she has too many segues, and sometimes these segues bleed into other segues, where Elizabeth is telling the story of one thing that happened to Toby, and then it bleeds into another story within that story, kind of like a story within a story. And it's like, finish one story before you tell me another. It can be pretty distracting, and sometimes I even forget like what she was even saying in the first place. She goes on like a couple tangents there. So I'd say that was a bit wonky. And then another issue that I have with the story is it does feel a little bit preachy at times, especially near the end. I understand that Taffy is trying to make a point here, but I feel like she could have made it more naturally in the story, whereas it just seems like she's coming out and just telling me what everything is about, and it feels a bit preachy and kind of kind of out there, kind of bland, like she's hitting you over the head with the point. Not as bad as some of the other stories that I read, but it is like clear enough that it's coming off kind of preachy. Like, definitely a good point to make, but still, preachy is preachy. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Fleishman is in Trouble by Taffy Brodesser-Akner. A really solid story. Probably one of the best that I've read this year. I know there's the recency effect, and I'm always saying that about some story that I read pretty recently, but I do think it is one of the better ones that I've read. It's up there with Stoner in terms of recognizing the sort of like existential terrors of everything in the world. We have to talk about Kevin, which there are some comparisons that I didn't make in this story, but I very well could have. A lot of really interesting things worth thinking about that are presented here. So I'm going to recommend that you go seek this out, read it, and let me know in the comments below what you think. I would love to have a discussion about this book with you. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can learn about Taffy. They don't already know about her as well as this book, which I feel like a fair amount of people might know, as it's pretty recent and it was like a bestseller or something like that. Until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and divorcey travels. Farewell.